Organizers, in advance of this weekend's protests, had said that they were noticing a little bit of a theme, sort of a trend. They were noticing not only that there were going to be more No Kings protests against Trump in more places than there ever had been before, but they said specifically they'd noticed kind of a red state spring happening. More signups, more planned protests against Trump in red states. And in places specifically, even within red states, that voted for Trump. They had said to expect that based on what they'd seen from signups. And then that's what happened this weekend. Look, this is what No Kings protests look like this weekend in northern Alabama, in Huntsville, Alabama, also in red state Alaska, in Anchorage, in the Villages in Florida, which is the biggest retirement community in the country. It's famously a nest of Republican votes for Republican politicians. But this was the Villages' huge No Kings anti-Trump protest this weekend. Also, check out Jonesboro, Arkansas. The county where Jonesboro, Arkansas is, Trump won that in 2024 by a 37-point margin. But now look, this weekend, Jonesboro, Arkansas is No Kings. This is Nebraska. Hastings, Nebraska, up there in the upper left. Adams County is where Hastings, Nebraska is. Trump won there in the last election by 40 points. But now here's Hastings, Nebraska, No Kings. Look at North Dakota. In the last election, Trump won that state by the largest margin in that state in a presidential election in more than 70 years. But you're looking in the upper right there, you're looking at Minot, North Dakota, where Trump won by nearly 50 points. Well, yeah, that was then. This was Minot, North Dakota this weekend, No Kings. This is not some, caricature of liberal America. Lower left there, that's Topeka, Kansas. Lower right there, that's Rapid City, South Dakota this weekend. I mean, behold, famously liberal Wyoming. Lower left there. WyomingNews.com says there were at least 20 different No Kings protests this weekend in Wyoming, including this one in Cheyenne at the state capitol. The local press reported that Cheyenne protest was significantly larger than previous No Kings protests at that site. Up in the upper left, that's Tupelo, Mississippi. In the upper right, that's Bluefield, West Virginia. Lower right, that's southern Indiana. That's Evansville, Indiana, where Trump won by 13 points in that county. But this weekend, that was Evansville, Indiana, No Kings. Some of the biggest protests in the whole country were in red states this weekend. Look at the upper left there. That's Boise, Idaho. Look at the turnout there. In the upper right, look at Salt Lake City, Utah. Louisville, Kentucky in the lower left there. Lower right, that huge protest in the lower right, that's Louisiana. That's New Orleans, Louisiana. Missoula, Montana, which is the upper left here. Look how big that is. They had pretty big crowds for the previous No Kings protests in Missoula, but this weekend, Missoula organizers said the turnout was double or possibly triple the turnout they had previously had on previous No Kings protests. Up the upper right there, that's Charlotte, North Carolina. You will remember that locals in Charlotte stood up mightily and protested and protested and protested against the attack on their city from Trump's federal ICE agents. Well, this was No Kings in Charlotte this weekend, a really big turnout. Lower left, that's Dallas, Texas. Lower right, that's Columbus, Ohio. The great state of Tennessee saw big protests for No Kings. Up in the upper left, that's Chattanooga, Tennessee. In the upper right, that's Nashville, Tennessee. Lower left, that's the state capital in Texas. That's Austin, Texas. Lower right, that big protest there is Columbia, South Carolina. Check that out. Here's Mississippi. Here's Hattiesburg, Mississippi in the lower right there. Look how big that is. Upper left, that's Little Rock, Arkansas. Upper right, that's Wichita, Kansas. Lower left, that's beloved Oklahoma City. So 3 times in 10 months now, we've had this big tent, peaceful protest movement against Trump, against this president trying to assume the powers of a king. And the breadth of what people have been able to build, the geographic spread of where people are organized, the sheer number of protests at each of these just goes up and up and up. But even in a deliberately decentralized, far-flung thing like this, where there's, we got 50 states, but we had more than 3,300 protests. Even in a decentralized, far-flung thing like this, there are still the places where just the sheer number of people in one place is overwhelming. Organizers say this weekend's flagship No Kings protest in St. Paul which you see there on the lower left, they say that was the largest demonstration of any kind in the history of the state of Minnesota. Biggest protest of any kind ever in that state. Los Angeles in the upper left there was huge. Boston, upper right there, that was huge, which was all the more impressive because there were more than 160 different No Kings protests in Massachusetts all at the same time. And Massachusetts isn't that big a state, but Boston still had nearly 200,000 people turn out at that one No Kings protest alone. Boulder, Colorado, lower right there, that was big as well. Boulder, Colorado was big, as was Denver, Colorado, which you see in the upper right there. And again, that is particularly impressive given that Denver and Boulder are only 30 miles apart. But both cities simultaneously had huge No Kings protests. Upper left there, look at that sea of people in Chicago, Illinois. Chicago, you would expect them to turn out numbers like that after that city fought back so hard against the attack on that city by Trump's ICE agents this year. San Francisco in the lower left there was huge. Lower right there, that's Minneapolis. And again, the size of the turnout in Minneapolis and on the other side of the river in St. Paul, where they had the largest demonstration in state history, both of those things happening on the same day. It's just very impressive. Philadelphia was really big. Philadelphia had been the flagship protest at an earlier No Kings, but look at how many people turned out in Philly for this one. San Diego was really big. Look at that lower right. Look how many people in San Diego. Washington, D.C. is lower left there. That was big. In D.C., some people from the No Kings protest marched to a military base where Trump administration officials, Trump cabinet officials, have been taking over military housing for themselves. So people at No Kings in D.C. made some noise there this weekend, reminding those folks in Trump's cabinet that even though they have looted those houses for themselves from the military, those are not their houses. Upper left, you're looking at New York City. The crowd was so large in New York City this weekend, even the New York Times had to begrudgingly concede that the New York City protest stretched for more than a mile on either side of Times Square. But again, it's not just that there were some really large protests and that the collective number of people protesting was one of the largest protests in American history ever. It's also the sheer number of places in which Americans were willing to turn out. So like in New York, for example, yes, there was that massive protest in New York City. But you know what? There were 150 No Kings protests all over New York State. I mean, here, just as a sampling, here's Albany in the lower right and Rochester in the lower left and Plattsburgh in the upper right and Buffalo, New York. In the great state of Georgia, there was a huge protest and march in Atlanta, which you might expect. But would you expect that there'd be 62 different No Kings protests all over the state of Georgia? In addition to Atlanta, here's Savannah and Sandy Springs and Decatur. In Arizona, there were surprisingly gigantic No Kings protests in Scottsdale, for example, but there were more than 70 protests statewide in Arizona. In some of these places, it was 95 degrees on Saturday. But here was Scottsdale and Mesa and Phoenix and Tempe and Tucson and Surprise, Arizona, which is one of the places they've been trying to put a huge Trump prison camp. The great state of Wisconsin had over 100 No Kings protests, including really big ones in Madison and in Milwaukee, but also in places like Greenfield and Shorewood and Brookfield and Eau Claire and the famously conservative city of Waukesha, Wisconsin. And the town of Dodgeville, which is west of Madison, Wisconsin. Dodgeville has about 4,000 people. In Dodgeville, more than 10% of the whole town showed up for the Dodgeville No Kings. And it was cold. New Jersey had more than 65 No Kings protests. Here's a look at Camden and Newton and Trenton and Toms River. Indiana, I mentioned Evansville before.